Hello and welcome to Outlook's The Outlier, the show where we get top names from the fields of politics, economics, industries, sports, the arts, science, music, literature, and so on for an interesting, informal, and intelligent conversation. Our outlier this week is poet and author Arundhathi Subramaniam. Arundhati has done deep and pioneering work on culture and spirituality, especially the Bhakti poetry movement of India. She has written 11 books in prose and in poetry, which include the much acclaimed When God is a Traveler, Love Without a Story, and the Penguin anthology of sacred poetry, Eating God. Arundhati is also closely associated with Isha Foundation, and she's written a book on its founder, Sadhguru. Thank you very much, Arundhati, for joining the Outlier.
Thank you, Satish. Looking forward to it.
It's such a delight to speak to you always.
Likewise.
Though, I know the times are, slightly melancholic and brooding and, kind of, there is doom and dread all around us. So I, in fact, wanted to start by asking, as a poet, as a thinking person, how has this pandemic affected you? How has it impacted you in your thoughts, in your mind?
I think it's, as you said, Satish, it's very clear. It's a time of great disquiet. And I think sometimes it's related to what's going on in our lives. I mean, the fact that we've never lived with in this kind of condition of self-imposed passivity, in a sense. We've never lived like this before for this length of time. But there's also the fact that I think we're also picking up some of this disquiet atmospherically, and that doesn't help.
Yes.
This has been collective. I think I started with a great sense of unease and restlessness. And I felt more dinned against than dinning, as I often said. I just felt I was picking up the noise of the world and I had no chance to really speak, to have a conversation back with it. But I think conversations like these have helped, So I've moved from unease to resignation, and now perhaps to moments of gratitude, even, I'd say. Because this has been a time of, it's been a chance to reboot, in a sense. It's been a chance to engage in some kind of self-reclamation. And I'm grateful for that. I certainly look at some things differently, particularly time. I realize there's just so much more time, not just to read and write and do the things that we love, but also more time for voluntary idleness, which I think I had actually missed out on. So I'm grateful for those moments. And I'm also grateful, and this I will say, I think there were many of us writers who spent a lot of our time hurtling from one airport to the other, sitting in on panel discussions endlessly at LitFest. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually glad that what we've replaced that with now is this kind of conversation, an intimate, exploratory conversation.
I think it has in some ways, I think, made most of us some sort of poets, philosophers, thinkers, I think, with so much time hanging and, with little to do, physically little to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What do you think? How do you think is it going to? How is humankind going to take this? What are we going to learn from it? Are we going to? Is it a? Do you think this is a sort of a life-changing experience for many people, or do you think we'll get over it, go back to our own ways? What was before?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think there's two ways to answer that. When things look bleak or when I'm not feeling terribly upbeat, I actually think we've just postponed the inevitable. And the inevitable is probably self-sabotage and the whole mission of planetary destruction that we seem to be hell-bent on.
Yes.
But there are other moments when I'm more upbeat. And thankfully, those moments prevail a little more often. And at times like those, I feel perhaps, Satish, that we are not... when an entire generation goes through something like this, which is an intense global pause, I'm not sure we will go completely untouched by it. I don't know how it will manifest. It will definitely take time to internalize and absorb. But I think we will see some shifts. One thing that we are definitely going to see is a great deal of creativity. I think that's already coming to the fore. And I don't just mean in the arts, I mean in science and medicine and technology. We're going to see a great deal of churning, and there's already plenty of evidence of that. So, yeah.
And of course, I mean, it's fine for us, who are so privileged to sit and say that it's made poets out of us and thinkers out of us. I mean, it is also sheer human tragedy that one has witnessed. I mean, which is absolutely heartbreaking. And I mean,
You know, I mean, you're absolutely right that one has the luxury to be a poet in times like these. I never quite forget that.
yeah,
But at the same time, I am a poet and not a policy maker, and thank God for it, because I mean, you've all been. I'm not inflicting myself in that capacity on you. But what I would say is that what I'm hearing and what I'm picking up, that's what I would talk about as a poet. And I think I'm picking up the fact that, and it's not just other people, I have gone through personal loss as well in these past few months. There's been a very direct confrontation with uncertainty and with tragedy, and coming out of or trying to process that in itself is going to be a journey, which is personal, at the same time shared with those who are similarly affected. But I believe one thing, I feel we are hearing are all around us questions about, one is certainly the whole question of health and what it means. I mean, doctors are talking about it. We are tuning into those conversations like never before. But we are also hearing questions about power. We are hearing questions about control. We're hearing questions about authority. We're hearing questions about freedom.
right.
We are hearing, now how this will manifest as policy, I cannot say. But I believe that there is an importance to those questions. And we are seeing certainly a fair amount of toxicity and reactivity as well. But I keep the faith that those questions, which are essentially questions about inclusive ways of being,
Yes.
I feel those questions have their own merit, and they will find their way to make themselves take deeper root. There's a kind of Amrit Manthan quality, isn't it? I think there's such a churning that it's difficult sometimes to keep the faith that any nectar can come of this.
Yeah.
But I'm almost certain it will, though I don't know how. And I don't know when.
And it has been in some ways also a great leveler. It has not spared anybody in the sense, poor, rich, rural, urban, or, a great country or a small country. So that way there is, there is this thing, it is a leveler in some ways.
Yes, absolutely. It has been that. And I think that's why these questions are coming up even, the shift in power dynamics, those are coming up simply because it's very difficult now to decide who the privileged is and who isn't. We're all in some very deep way implicated, complicit, affected.
Yeah. But at the same time, do you think, it may also make human beings as well as countries, in some ways more insular? We are, that we'll get more suspicious of each other. This thing of, man is such a social animal, but this virus is telling us to keep away. It goes so contrary to what we naturally are.
That's true, Satish. But as I also said, I think what I've found, which is an unexpected fallout of these times, is that I'm having conversations like never before. Long, intimate, truly searching conversations.
Absolutely.
So I don't know. I think maybe we are finding different ways of relating to each other. I look forward to an unmasked and embodied interaction, but I think in the interim, something is going on. I don't just see this as a time of passivity, as I said at the start. I think there's a great deal of subterranean ferment.
Yeah.
And there's things going on under the ground, for all of us.
Yes. Ever since the pandemic struck in the last few months, we have all lost so many things. Many of us have lost our loved ones. We've lost our jobs. Many have lost their careers, and so many things have gone as we knew it. But do you think we have also found many things?
I can speak for myself, I think, Satish. I think for me, what has been important, and I suspect this may resonate with some people because I'm hearing this when I talk to friends. You know, sometimes one writes a poem and almost always a poem is wiser than one is. So I wrote a poem a few months ago, and there was a line there that struck me. And I said, this is what I need to remind myself of. The line there was, meaning won't save us, but rhythms will. And I asked myself what I really meant by that and how I could use that to navigate my way through my day. And I feel what it pointed me to is the fact that I feel I'm called upon, and perhaps a few others are too, and maybe more than a few, called upon to move away from just a head-driven agenda, just the diktats of the thinking mind. The thinking mind is hugely important, but I've also felt the need to tune in to other rhythms, the rhythms of body, the rhythms of heart. And I'm using that word very advisedly because, it's easy to see language of the heart and so on as the kind of soft language, that the hard language that we're meant to be talking about now is policy, for instance, And I think while those are important, it's equally vital to bring in some of these wisdom languages that we all have, not to give up the language of the mind at all, but to seek ways of integrating these other languages, because I think we are being called upon like never before to draw on our own empathic resources, with the situation around us, certainly with ourselves. And those wisdoms are also just as vital.
Arundhati, you've done, so much work on spirituality, about God, religion. It seems that in our country, there is a new fervor in religion, especially Hinduism. It's found a new energy, it seems, especially with the Ram temple now being built, etc. But do you also feel that, there is a certain stridency in it? It's there is a sort of a muscular religion that we are talking about now than what we understood it to be?
Satish, I think there have always been different kinds of language employed by gatekeepers, and a different kind of language employed by those who are spiritual travelers. That's always been the case. And this is across faiths. It's across, I think, often politics as well, the political sphere. It's across culture. One encounters this everywhere. Stridency is something, as a poet and as a seeker, is not a tone that I relate to. But that's because very clearly on this journey, there is the language of the sentry or the soldier, and there is the language of the seeker. There is the language of the crusader, and there is the language of the quester. And those languages have always been different. So I'd say that I'm aware at this point that we're living in this moment when in many insidious ways we are being surrounded by a language of dogmatism, and also a language of jingoism. I sometimes say it's the language of slogan and the language of the smiley. It feels like these are the only two options. And I have no problem with either and using both of them intermittently, but I don't want to be compelled to choose these as the only two alternatives in my life. I'm interested very deeply in the wisdom traditions of this subcontinent in particular, but I've also been nourished by many other traditions. And I think that for me has been the wonderful thing about being Hindu. And that's what I value about being Hindu and what I've always valued. But we live in a time of such binaries that if you are not engaging in a kind of chest-thumping triumphalism, then you are in some way anti-faith.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you are deeply interested, as I am, in Bhakti literature and devotional literary traditions, then in some way you're some kind of treacherous right-winger. Both extremes to me are problematic, and I've had to find my own way of listening to other ways of articulating journeys. I mean, for me, because my preoccupation is language, that is something that interests me hugely. The language of the tone of stridency, monotonous. One wants more. There is a deep thirst for more that I think many of us, and I suspect that I'm part of a very fatigued majority, feels that way. That we want more. We want other tones, other ways of discovery, to talk about discovery, other ways to talk about celebration, other ways to talk about belonging. And that's something that interests me more and more. In fact, you mentioned Bhakti earlier as well, and I talked about it too, and we've often had conversations about this, Satish.
Yeah.
I'd say that one of the things that the Bhakti poets remind me of is something that's helped me to look at the whole question of rage differently. You know, for one, as soon as you say spiritual, most people believe that you're talking about some kind of placid, tepid, boiled cabbage type of tranquility. You know what I mean? A kind of really lukewarm, sedateness. The first thing I will say is there is nothing sedate about these poems. You know, there's nothing lifeless about these poems. They're full of intensity and octane and fuel and voltage. You know, so in that sense, the capacity to express rage is something that they do very effectively, the finest poems. At the same time, they are for me a constant reminder that it is possible to express rage without expressing hatred. That it's possible to feel anger against God. Usually they're having conversations with God, the God of their understanding. It's possible to feel anger with this God. It's possible to rail against this God, to hurl swear words at this God. As I say in one of my poems, it's possible to throw a tantrum in verse and call it a prayer. You know, you can take liberties with this God, but you never stop loving him or her. And this for me is a key. You know, it's a key for me to approach not just personal relationships, but it's in many ways, I think, it could be a key for many of us who feel called upon to take stands, but who know that dissent is not necessarily disloyalty. At the same time, dissent is not ridicule. It's not contempt of another. And that's something the Bhakti poets remind us of, because they never stop loving God. You know, they never stop that love. What they're saying is really that when you are attempting to speak this language of the heart, there is no other. So you can quarrel as much as you want with this God, but you can quarrel because it's a language of such intimacy.
Yeah.
You know, this is a God who's more intimate than your own breath. So of course you can quarrel. You can do anything you want, but there's nothing taboo, nothing outrageous about it. But the fact is that you're part of the same continuum. You're just choosing to play this game, this whole dance of duality, this whole theater of multiplicity. But you're not separate, essentially. You can never completely other this adversary and this lover, who are both the same thing. I feel that for me, it gives me a key, really, in the way in which I would like to express my stand on many, many issues.
And
the
how
rage is not hatred. Sorry.
And how things have changed since, you know, this relationship between the devotee and the God, of more of a friend, of a loved one, to something who's feared and revered only, you know, in the present, you know, that is a real shift that has happened, isn't it?
I think the Bhakti poets were certainly capable of revering their God. You know, God was definitely sublime, but God was also intimate. God was also domestic. He was both, or she was both at the same time. I think perhaps we've lost that resonance, or it's also unfortunate. I think actually seekers have always found these resonances for themselves, Satish. What I think we've lost, though, is when we speak of adherence or obedience in the political sphere, you know, and we use the word bhakt to talk of adherence to some kind of right-wing politics. I think we reduce the tremendous power of the word bhakti. Bhakti was never meant to be uncritical obedience. It never was. You have to just read these poems to know that. The Bhakta is someone who has a spirited, argumentative, sometimes erotic relationship with God, a conversation with God. The devotee is not a doormat, and I always say this, the deity is not a dictator. So it's completely antithetical to our current understanding or our current usage of the word bhakt and bhakti. What I've loved about these poems is that you can, I think this is our tradition, this is our incredible freedom, Satish. This is the freedom, this is the incredible plurality of this tradition, that we are capable of choosing our gods. We have the freedom, the license to choose our gods. A remote god if you want up there in Kailash, or the god in your wayside shrine just down your street. As concrete and local as that. The license to choose your god. The license to invent your god if you don't find a god who meets your taste and temperament. And even the license eventually to discard your god. And you can still be a quester. Still someone who seeks freedom. Still someone on the quest for liberation. Of course, you don't often get to discard your god because your god has usually devoured you before that, according to the Bhakti poets. But there is the license to discard, which is what Tukaram has in his beautiful poem, where he says to his God finally, he says, for me, God is dead. But this is not a philosophical statement. It is an experiential. He's talking about a deep moment of experiential self-discovery. It's not a doctrinal statement. I think this is the difference.
Do you think today poets can write the kind of stuff the Bhakti poets were writing at that time, or would it be completely misunderstood?
The first thing I'd say is one doesn't write a poem. One doesn't have to write a rage poem to God simply to make a statement. And I think that's the important thing to remember even about the Bhakti poets. They were not doing it as some kind of, I don't want to present them even as some kind of poster boys or girls for feminism or progressive politics. That's not what I'm saying. They could be politically incorrect. Very often they were. There were all kinds of sectarian tensions, all of that, in their time too. But if we pick out threads from these poems, if we listen in, we find that the dominant tone or spirit or breeze that blows through these poems is one of freedom. I think that breeze continues to blow through poetry. I certainly have poems in which I implicate the sacred, but I don't see the sacred in any way as divorced from all the other things that concern me. Mud, lovers, cities, gender politics. It's not separate from any of those. And I think in their essence, that's what the Bhakti poets remind us of, that there is no real divide between all that we consider to be worldly and what we consider to be sacred.
Would you like to talk a little bit about the Bhakti movement, the poets themselves, in the sense that it spanned a lot of our country and it was for a long period?
Absolutely. And I think there's been tremendous diversity as well, so we can't even talk of it as a unitary movement.
Okay.
But what I find startling about those poems, Satish, I mean, it seems to have started in Tamil Nadu, in Tamil country, between the 6th and 9th centuries, very passionate poems to Shiva and Vishnu. But because these were poems of such ferocious longing, they couldn't be contained within any kind of gated community, whether of caste or class or language or gender. And so they seem to spread from south to west to north to east. And so there's not a place, as you point out, there's not a crevice in this entire subcontinent that is not touched by Bhakti. But what I think we don't talk about enough is the wisdom. Going back to what I said earlier, there is a wisdom here. We often talk of the Bhakti poets as almost as kind of overwrought emotional creatures. And we polarize the path of jnana and bhakti, the path of knowledge and the path of the heart, the path of the mind and the path of the heart. In fact, I think, and most seekers realize this soon enough, these are not mutually exclusive paths. And so there's a deep science as well, or a deep intelligence in this language of the heart that the Bhakti poets talk about. They invite us to explore every crevice, every toxic, suppurating corner of the heart, which speaks an inconvenient language, a language we don't want to hear. The heart is a risky place. It's a dangerous address. And they're inviting us to that place of danger. Because eventually, bhakti is a science of, or an alchemy of self-transformation. That's where they take us, you know. And I'm very interested, Satish, now, increasingly, in the female presence in many of these poems. Mm. So that's something that's a deepening preoccupation. Because I find, I'm sorry?
That what you're working on now is, would that be a new area to sort of delve into?
Yes, it's actually a deepening of an earlier area. Mm-hmm. I felt the need to listen to these voices because they're voices of such, for one, just sheer courage and rage and irreverence and sometimes eroticism. You know, so all those put together, whether it's an Akka Mahadevi who says, take these husbands who die, decay, and feed them to your kitchen fires. Or whether it's Lal Ded who says, I roasted my heart and pestled it in the mortar of love. The diction is so energetic and violent, almost. You're being reminded that even the kitchen is not a safe space. You know, if these are the women you have in your heart, tending to your heart, you're reminded that the heart is a dangerous place. Yeah. And the very same poems, when they take you from heart to bedroom, you're reminded that the bedroom is another very dangerous place. And in fact, many of the male poets take on the female voice at this point, because they seem to find that there is a certain freedom with which you can speak to God. When you are, especially if it's a male God, there's a certain freedom and a leveling out that happens when you speak in the female voice. Because suddenly you are also desired by this male god. Krishna pines for Radha, as Jayadeva tells us, as much as Radha for him. Annamacharya's heroine, for instance, is able to say, God is my master, God is my slave, all in the same breath. You know, Annamacharya's heroine is able to say to her God, and this is wonderful for all those who think that bhakti poetry is just about wanting some god to come and ravish you, which is the traditional trope. Annamacharya's heroine is able to tell her God, unless I want it myself, it doesn't count as love. Mm. You know? So there are all these ways in which we are being reminded that this hierarchy between the human and the divine is a very unstable, very unpredictable, very exciting one.
You know, Arundhati, do you sometimes feel that, you know, this whole bhakti poetry, it is not quite taught to us properly. You know, we sort of, you know, in schools and colleges, we sort of skim through it and then we, you know, sort of go away. But it's such a force. I mean, it's so powerful. I mean, it's so much our culture. Absolutely. Why is it that, you know, half of us don't even know about it? Why half? I mean, even more than that.
And I didn't either. You know, I grew up with it like many of us do. I watched dance performances that used a lot of poetry, say by Kshetraya or Annamacharya or many of these others, Tyagaraja. But I saw it as goody-goody poetry, you know. I saw it as sanitized stuff. Yeah. I thought of devotion as some sort of anemic, asexual affair, which is why it seemed boring. I never thought that it was something that was this brazen, inconvenient, and this transformative, deeply transformative. I never realized that it was so fundamentally about freedom. Because the bhakti poets are not inviting us to bondage. They're not inviting us to club membership. This is something to remember, I think, particularly now when we just seem to see faith, politics, everything in terms of little cartels and clubs, you know. They're not inviting us to a secure place. they're inviting us to a place of sometimes terror.
Yeah.
You're not going to come out of bhakti unscathed. That's what our bhakti poets tell us. I don't think I was ever given a whiff of that when I was in school or college.
True. So what do what do you think can be done to, I mean, it's such a treasure we have, more people should partake of it, the more people should be interested in it. What do you think can be done? Do you think, I mean, is it to do with something to our curriculum?
I think our curriculum sometimes, Satish, it's often not what we are being taught as much as how we are being taught it. Even if you have a curriculum that talks to you about those dreaded, I mean, what is now called the dead white male poet, even if you have that in your curriculum, it's how that is imparted to you that matters. Absolutely. It is not really the fact that you have to constantly critique it simply because it comes from a particular place. But yes, I think it would be wonderful to have a curriculum that includes more of these voices, but much more importantly, it's about how that is imparted. It is very easy to present these as pasteurized voices. It's very easy to whitewash these, to present them as just voices of some kind of dominant religious narrative. But that's not what they are. So it's the how that matters, I think.
Yeah, in fact, as you're saying, I mean, this is something so vibrant, so full of life. I mean, one can only be, I suppose once touched, can only go deeper and deeper into it.
Yes, absolutely. Which, as I'm discovering, particularly during this time, it's been a time of really deepening discovery.
Yes. Is that what you mean by being a seeker?
That's such a good question. Part of it, Satish, part of it. Poetry is part of my quest, for sure, a very integral part of my quest. But I'm also aware that there was a time in my life when even words didn't come to my rescue. So I'm aware that poetry itself, and a lot of sacred poetry, or what we call sacred poetry, is an invitation to go deeper than word, to also inhabit pauses, to also inhabit silences, which are places of great terror for many of us.
Yes. Have you been writing recently? Would you like to read something that you've written recently for us, or anything that you would like to read actually, which could provide some solace maybe in these dreadful times?
Let me read you, I was going to read you a Tukaram poem, which I love.
Okay, great.
I'm also just going to read you before that a very short poem that I wrote recently, which was published recently. And I'm choosing to read it because it has the line that I mentioned to you about meaning not being what we need to look for now, but rhythm. Okay. I think we've all been through periods of great, when time has moved achingly slowly for most of us. There have been times when we felt tyrannized by time, but there have also been moments of great illumination that almost everyone has experienced, moments of magic, moments of when we're improvising rather than simply following a rhythm. Yeah. The world takes a breath. The world takes a breath noisily, recycling anodyne text messages about the wisdom of looking within, photographs of mute anguish to give us our daily fix of indignation, a wild pandemic of pieties. Who'd have thought an empty hour was so much labor? We walk the day most times on steel girders of habit, knowing that as long as there are lists, the world is safe. And meaning won't save us, never has, but rhythms will. And only sometimes does all the fumbling and twitching swivel into immaculate choreography. And the sky falls away like blue laughter, and we are cycling hands-free on air.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you.
And you said would you like to read
a poem? If there is time, I'd love to share that. It's an old favorite, Satish.
Okay.
And it's a wonderful reminder for me. I go back to this often.
Okay.
It's a wonderful reminder that crisis can be a time of tremendous possibility. So if you're allergic to the word God, you could substitute it with, I don't know, goddess, grace, possibility, however you choose to see it. But it's a ringing, resonant, wonderful translation by Dilip Chitre. When he comes out of the blue, a meteorite shattering your home, be sure God is visiting you. When a catastrophe wipes you out and nothing remains but God and you, God is visiting you. When your language is stripped naked, never to be clothed in falsehood again, God is visiting you. When your humanity is rent and riven, never to be pieced together again, God is visiting you. When you are beyond all hope, when you call nothing your own, God is visiting you. When you are robbed of the whole world and your voice becomes eloquent, be sure God is visiting you. See how God has grabbed the whole of him. Tuka is now raging like God himself.
Fantastic. Really good. Yes.
It's a poem to return to.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely true. Thank you very much, Arundhati.
Thank you.
It was a real delight to speak to you always. A very thoughtful and very meaningful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for making it happen, Satish. Always enjoy conversations.
Thank you for being on the Outlier.